looks so
No,
good.
it
Are you
doesn't.
serious?
Does it? You swear?
Swear.
Welcome to this afternoon session on true cross-platform campaign attribution. My name is Tim Peterson. I am a senior reporter at Digiday. And before we get started with today's session talking about cross-platform attribution, as great as that intro was that we just had, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves to be able to add a baseline for the conversation we'll be having today. Dana, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure, I'm Dana McGraw, and I oversee the data science and audience modeling functions for the Disney ad sales team.
Hey there, Asaf Davidov, VP of Ad Sales Research at Hulu, overseeing all of our measurement, attribution, measurement capabilities.
And my name is Ashwin Navin, co-founder and CEO of Samba TV, a global TV data and analytics company.
Great. And as I mentioned, I'm Tim Peterson, a senior reporter at Digiday. So cross-platform attribution, campaign attribution is a big topic, an important topic, but also something of a very insidery topic for some. So Asaf, I'd love if we could start off by you just kind of explaining what cross-platform campaign attribution is, because that'll give us a really nice foundation for the conversation we're going to be having today.
Sure, yeah. We'll break those words apart. We'll start with, campaign attribution. Campaign effectiveness is really, in its simplest form, being able to measure the outcome of an advertising campaign being seen on some sort of measure. When we talk attribution, it usually means bottom of the funnel, and we'll talk a little bit more maybe about that, but some sort of conversion metric, whether that's walking into a store, which people are starting to do, thankfully, more and more these days, going onto a website, buying a product in store, and really the ability to connect those ad exposures to some sort of measure. When we talk about cross-publisher or cross-platform campaign effectiveness, it's the ability to do that across a bunch of different properties. So let's say an ESPN and a Hulu and an ABC on mobile devices, on CTV, on PCs, and both on linear and on digital. And that last piece is really the most important component of this, and something that our friends at Samba have been able to help us solve is connecting both the digital world and the TV world, and trying to find what the actual measure of success for that campaign was for that particular advertiser.
Got it. And that was fantastic. And so it seems like there's a lot in there. And I kind of, when I hear people talk about, especially cross-platform campaign attribution, I kind of start thinking of Lester Freeman from The Wire and just having a bunch of red string connecting dots all over an entire room and just building this whole web. In order to do this, though, then you kind of need the individual pins, which in this case would be the data. And so love to talk about the data that both Disney as well as Hulu have that they're bringing to the fore. And then Ashwin, obviously you're filling in the gaps with the ACR data from Samba. But Dana, can we start with you and talk about the data and the role of both the data that you have available here and then the role of that data in being able to perform this cross-platform campaign attribution?
Sure, yeah. So our first-party data really is kind of second to none in terms of scale, in terms of our relationship with our guests and consumers, which really enhances how valid and how useful your first-party data is. When you have a real relationship with one another, it really fills out the total profile and the total picture. So if you think about sort of what Asaf was explaining with regard to attribution, when you have that data and on the front end, you want to be targeting kind of the right audience for the right outcomes, those two things kind of marry together. So on the front end, you're understanding a brand's KPIs and what they're trying to achieve with regard to attribution. And then on the front end, you're leveraging kind of scaled audience segmentation, machine learning models to direct the advertising to the right audience in the beginning so that there's no wasted inventory towards the attribution outcome on the back end.
Got it. And then Asaf, from the Hulu perspective, what's the data? And also, if you could talk about how that data then is complemented with the data from Disney ad sales.
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate to have, subscribers who share a little bit about, who they are, what they're doing. We know a little bit about what they're watching. We're never looking at an individualized basis, but we're looking in aggregate to understand better viewer behaviors and all of that stuff. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to, tie to Dana's data sets to better understand, like all of these different platforms, where people are watching, how they jump from one platform to another, to better kind of put together all of the fragmented viewing that's happening on so many different platforms.
Yeah, and I'll add, it's been really, exciting and interesting for us because we've had obviously a partnership with Hulu for a really long time before that partnership sort of advanced to where it is today. And so we've had a real understanding of what incrementality looks like across all of kind of the Disney audience and then adding in the Hulu audience and what that means not only for incrementality, which is huge for us, the incremental audience there, but also kind of supplementality. So how we think about sequencing of messages and retargeting and re-reach as we're sort of this combined entity working together.
And to even add some context to that, and this kind of connects to some of the work that we're doing with Samba, we're starting to do this work more as a combined entity, but at Hulu, we've been touting that 60% of viewers who see an ad campaign will not have seen that ad on linear television. So it's truly that complementary reach to a larger linear television buy. Now that we're part of the Disney family and can kind of extend that, being able to connect those people to all of those different platforms is crucial.
Yeah, 60%, that's a big number. And that's also an interesting number because it can be really hard, or at least historically has been really hard to even get to that number, to be able to determine, okay, who saw my ad on linear TV, who saw my ad on streaming, is that the same person, or what the overlap is. Ashwin, I'll bring in you now. Can you talk about Samba and how Samba fills in that gap?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, it's a great privilege to be able to work with a company like Disney, now integrating Hulu. What we've been able to see with Samba's data is that it's the really unique combination of a massive linear platform, from the Disney-owned media networks that we can measure at Samba, married with the robust data that you just heard about. Very few companies in the world can deliver this scale that Disney can, in a very rich and high quality environment to present brands. And now we have the data to prove it. Samba's data is built off of a piece of technology that goes within the TV operating system. And it's a footprint of TVs that's massive in scale, millions of screens across the world that are basically allowing us to understand what's on the screen at any given moment. And when you aggregate that data, you can actually start to understand really the scale that not only Disney has, but the linear platform continues to drive. A great place to drive brands, to build desire for products that a media company like Disney can start to stitch together across all of its consumer touch points to deliver a really unique and valuable platform for brand building. Our data is basically plugging in to bring in complete awareness with linear television, bringing linear television basically up to the same level of robustness that you can measure digital and OTT.
Got it. And Ashwin, ACR, that's obviously your whole game. That's where Samba TV very much plays. And this is an acronym. It's not entirely a new acronym. It stands for Automated Content Recognition, but I know it's an acronym that's coming up in a lot more conversations that I'm having over the past year. And I know there are also people who are just, now moving into the streaming space because maybe they're historically digital display, buyers, or they're in the traditional TV space, but now that's obviously converging with streaming. And so they're learning more about ACR. Can you kind of give us a quick 101 on what exactly ACR is? You touched on it a bit, and how it works too, because I think anytime we're talking about data, and especially new types of data, and being able to measure TV viewership, people may be thinking, oh, is this just a new Nielsen panel? Or people just filling out diaries? How does ACR data work?
It's a great question. I would think about ACR as sort of the third generation of TV data. The first generation came into existence in the 20th century when video was broadcasted over the air. And the only way to measure it was with a meter that would sit in a living room, where you would manually sort of collect data either through a meter or through maybe even a paper diary where people would write down what they watched. And that was appropriate for the 20th century. As we approach the 21st century, we understand that, cable represented a very large number of hours spent in the living room. And so, you started to see panels augmented by return path data from the set-top boxes, which was appropriate for a channel guide of, say, 500 channels delivered through cable. And now you can start to really see the scale of data increase and fill in the gap of, what panels couldn't do when a large number of channels. Over the top completely shattered those methodologies. In the 21st century, when you have truly infinite choice, what we wanted to build and what we invented at Samba was basically a form of signal processing that's analyzing audio and visual signals that arrive at your television, regardless of whether they came over the air or through cable or through a streaming source. We're not so much concerned in the 21st century with how you get your video. It's really about being able to understand video consumption at massive scale using very robust software and algorithms that we developed in-house and deployed in the TV operating system. So this is really allowing the living room to be better understood today than it ever has been historically. You marry that understanding with identity and the ability to deduplicate linear with other media touch points, and you get a really powerful platform like the one we're talking about today with Disney.
Got it.
And that's
So
really a
Dana,
huge
please.
part of, our partnership with Samba, and what's been so interesting to us is that idea of being platform agnostic and just understanding the consumption pattern and understanding targeting the right audience at the right time for the right outcomes. And so that work with Samba for us is you're able, and most are able, to build a pretty robust audience segmentation on digital data. But our ability to kind of bring in that viewership data and then overlay all of the kind of models and segments that you've built using digital data on top of that linear data, and then really truly be kind of platform agnostic into how you're delivering to the best audiences. That's what's been a real kind of excitement and interest to us about our relationship with Samba.
And Dana, to that point, it feels like there's at least one school of thought of we're getting to a world at some point in the near future where an impression is an impression is an impression. If I'm watching an ABC show, should it matter whether I'm watching that through my cable box or whether I'm streaming it over the top through a connected TV device, or if I'm watching it on my phone through the TV Everywhere app? There are others who say, specifically on the buy side, and this may be a negotiating tactic as much as anything, but who may say, well, it's more valuable to have it in one context, and if it's in a different context, I don't want to be paying as much, or I'm willing to pay more. What's Disney's approach with this? How are you looking at kind of how these different platforms stitch together?
We're really thinking about it from kind of an outcome and a funnel approach, and how they stitch together with regard to scale and with regard to specific actions and outcomes. So it's it's less about a specific platform. It's more about kind of your goals and outcomes. So, at the top of the funnel, obviously there's awareness and there's reach and there's sort of affinity for a brand. And then moving down the funnel towards a specific action, what kind of action you might take has a lot to do with the context and sort of your context, not just the context of the content, but what context are you in when you're consuming it? So we're really taking the approach of let's talk about the funnel together and let's understand what action at each part of the funnel. And that goes to that linear to digital retargeting, the sequencing of the messaging, the shaping of the frequency of the messaging for the desired outcome at each step of the funnel.
Got it. And speaking of targeting, and Asaf, I'll kick this one off to you. When we talk about attribution, I feel like oftentimes, and rightfully so, people just think about the measurement side because attribution is often a measurement thing. I ran my ads. I want to know, what did that do for my business? To what extent did it lead people to visit my website, come into my stores, call my call center, what have you? But I imagine there's also a targeting component where you can get a bit more proactive as opposed to reactive with attribution. How does targeting fit into all of this?
Yeah, I'll probably let Dana speak more to it than me as the measurement guy, but I will tell you that, it's exactly what she was just mentioning. Again, starting with the full funnel, being able to understand where people are, what that audience looks like. In a linear world, you were targeting a show as a proxy for an audience. Now we understand the audience. We understand how many times they've seen something. We understand if they're in market for something. And that, understanding that closed loop of like, yeah, did they actually buy something means I can maybe now target them a little bit smarter. But I'll kick it to Dana because she's definitely smarter than me at that.
No, that's exactly right. It's the closed loop. It's starting with kind of propensity scoring. So propensity to be the chief, household decision maker to buy a consumer packaged good, or propensity, to go to a certain location or to buy a certain brand. And then the closed loop around, okay, so we targeted based on this propensity or a desired propensity, right? To generate a new consumer who maybe wasn't there, but graduate them to a new level of engagement with that brand. And then the closed loop with the soft, and our teams work very closely together around, this is the attribution, this is the measurement. Here's kind of a continuous feedback loop of how we then update our models and improve them so that we're targeting very efficiently across the board.
And speaking of the updating, Dana, you had mentioned retargeting before, and I know when we talk about the traditional digital display advertising space and retargeting, an example people always point to is the pair of pants or the shoes that chase them around the internet, and they kind of yell out into the void, "I already bought them. Why am I still seeing this ad?" How is this progressing so that like the retargeting becomes really effective, but that it doesn't get to the point of annoyance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so that's where kind of the frequency shaping, the frequency capping, kind of frequency management, and sort of the data-driven targeting, retargeting all go together, is you have to think about it holistically. It can't be kind of retargeting, oh, they saw it, go again, go again. It has to be sort of joined together. And that's a lot of the thought partnership that we've gotten from Ashwin and his team around, they've done a great job kind of with tools around frequency and understanding that. And then how do we sort of bring that together? And it's really interesting when you think about targeting, and as targeting really extends to linear, that gets even more interesting. So with that ACR data, we overlay all of the models that we've built. You think about data-driven linear. So then kind of the whole universe starts to be more and more in scope of what you're thinking about. And so it becomes less rudimentary that you're just kind of, but they were here once, let's do it again, and let's do it again. You're really shaping an entire strategy around how you want that message to work.
I would even add to that. I mean, I think that question in itself is why we're here talking about this right now, because the signals to figure out, like, is Tim seeing that pair of pants over and over, and did he actually buy those pants, weren't happening. And so what we're all, Ashwin, Dana, and I are all trying to figure out from different sides is how do we make those connections so we don't have Tim see that same pair of pants over and over again.
Right. And it's off to that point, then what's needed or possible from the advertiser perspective in terms of them being able to contribute their data to so that, if it's a sneaker company, they can know whether I already bought those sneakers 3 weeks ago or not?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, types of studies that we can run, especially, kind of running through the Samba partnership. We talked about full funnel. We can measure brand efficacy. So, people need to know about your product, about your brand before you actually buy that. We can run a lot of different studies that way, understand which creative is helping to better drive conversions for people over longer periods of time. And then to what I was sort of saying earlier, like, some businesses are cash businesses. QSR tends to be very cash driven. So understanding people's, clusters of people walking into a McDonald's may be, one outcome that helps us understand, are people actually doing that? Let me understand what the kind of makeup is of people who walk into a McDonald's, that kind of thing. Advertisers can also bring their CRM data to the table, and we can connect that together and try to understand on a more kind of one-to-one basis who is Tim or people who look like Tim, and let me try to find clusters of people to better estimate if Tim actually bought that pair of pants. I'm going to keep using that example.
And that's a space, where we're doing, to your question around kind of onboarding, there's a couple of use cases, right? There's kind of blind matching the data in a really compliant way to suppress an audience that that you already know how to reach and you don't want to pay for again. So there's a suppression use case. And then, to Hassaf's point, we've done a ton of work in the lookalike modeling space where there's a space where, okay, we know these are really high value folks and we want to find more who behave very much like them. and continue to kind of target that really high value audience. So it comes into kind of both ways. You suppress people that you don't want to pay for again because you want to be really efficient in new acquisitions, or you want to continue to reach these people, whether it's for a new offering or whatever it is, and then reach more people who behave in the same way.
And I think that depends on the KPI for that particular advertiser. If reach is the only KPI that an advertiser cares about, we frequency cap at 1, and we'll try to reach as many people as we possibly can. But to drive conversions, we usually see that you need to be exposed more often. And how do you sort of balance that? Maybe somebody just wants to build a brand, which only takes a few exposures. So kind of having that conversation with the advertiser is really important for us to figure out what the right measurement solution is. And then on, the other side of the coin, the targeting for the next campaign.
Right. And I want to get back to that because you're kind of walking us down the path towards outcome-based attribution, which obviously is a huge topic and something a lot of advertisers caring very much about these days. But Ashwin, I want to go to you and talk about just the measurement you're able to do in terms of exposures, because obviously, like, we've seen just viewership balloon across the board this year because people have been at home a lot and they have a lot more time, and so they spend that time often in front of their TV or other screens in the home. But I imagine you're not able to directly measure every single household. Can you talk about the projections you're able to do over there? And then when it comes to the attribution side, to what extent you're able to account for, okay, if, let's say you can't measure, my exposures specifically, but to what extent you can kind of gauge whether I was exposed to something, so then that can be connected to whether I bought the pants or not.
Yeah, it's 2 good questions. So on the first one, Samba's technology is present within 20 different brands of televisions. Things that are, probably the cheapest smart TV at the store shelf all the way up to probably the most expensive TV at the store shelf. So we get to a very broad number of demographics domestically and internationally. But there's a rigorous sort of panelization effort that our data science team undertakes to figure out how do we use the subset of this footprint of televisions that we think is geographically, demographically balanced and projectable, so that you can actually, on a normalized basis, use this data to make decisions to understand the living rooms at census level, even though you're still using a panel, just happens to be a lot bigger panel than anything that we've seen in the past. And obviously one that can cross over from traditional linear to digital identities. Once you've made that crossover from traditional to linear and from linear to digital, you can start to connect linear in ways that hasn't been possible in the past. With high fidelity, you can start to marry the exposure of a traditional ad to potentially a subsequent exposure, as Dana was talking about earlier, on a digital platform, and then see what the combined effect would be at the lower funnel, whether it's a purchase or a website visit or an app install. These are all things that you can start to stitch together very accurately. So you can see the consumer journey at every step, whether it's linear that drove the conversion or digital, or how that combination might work better, or even potentially how combinations of certain creatives ultimately might drive the best outcomes. And so really that's sort of a high level overview of how these things all come together. Something methodologically that we've been working on with Disney is, how do you actually drive not just correlative assumptions around which of these things drive the sale, but how do you get to causal relationships at every step of the consumer journey? Which one was it that you can say was the differentiating factor that might have driven the sale? And as you probably can imagine, it's not the most popular thing to say in Silicon Valley these days, but linear and video drives a ton of awareness and conversion. Because our world has been so swallowed into last touch, we probably overvalued that last click in the way that we're thinking about the value. That desire and awareness and demand for that brand or that product was probably built months in advance, and we can actually now prove that because we see the consumer at every step of the consumer journey.
Got it. And Ashwin, you just kind of hinted at LastClick attribution, which has been, I think, for a lot of people, the only type of attribution they may have known historically, because that was the big one, certainly in the digital space. kind of going to go backwards with this. So I'm going to ask you about kind of outcome-based attribution, where things stand right now. And then Dana, I'm curious like how this then comes in from a sales and targeting perspective to be able to like consider outcomes in that way. Because I think historically an advertiser might have just said, okay, we're going to set up this campaign and hopefully the outcomes can be there. It seems like they can be a bit smarter with things right now. But Asaf, today with outcome-based attribution, how full funnel is it? Is it able to cover every single type of outcome, regardless of the type of advertiser?
So we can measure pretty much every part of the funnel. What's missing today, and we're making some progress on, is being able to connect every single person at every point in that funnel. So at what point did Tim become aware? And then at what point was he then sort of considering buying a brand, buying that, or engaged with the product, maybe went into a store? And then when did he actually purchase? And I think because of that, you know, I understand the need for last touch attribution, because it just seems cleanest to say that, like, all right, the place that Tim bought his pants is the only place that he ever learned about that brand or that product. And we know just from being humans that that's not true. But we have to evolve sort of the measurement around that. And we're trying to figure out different components of it. So being able to do that. Being able to solve that is obviously really crucial. We're figuring that out now. From like an outcome-based guarantee standpoint, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like, it depends on the KPI, and advertising is a partnership between the publisher and the advertiser. And I think there needs to be a conversation about like what is actually being, you know, what are we trying to accomplish? At the end of the day, everybody's trying to sell a product. That's fine. What if Hulu or, you know, or Disney, ESPN, ABC drives you to that website, and then you're not in the need for that product? Or, you know, it's $7 billion and you don't want to spend that much on a pack of gum. Is that really just the publisher's fault? I think there's probably a lot of back and forth, and I'm not saying that any advertisers are saying that that's the case, but there has to be some sort of compromise on like, what are we trying to really figure out? So I don't know that the marketplace has really moved to outcomes-based guarantees. I think there's still a lot more work to be done to get to that place.
Yeah, and certainly no one should be trying to sell a $7 million piece of gum unless it's like
Gold
Obama chewed it or something like that. Dana, outcome-based attribution, as we've been talking about, is, you know, something of a newer capability. How is this, you know, changing the conversations with advertisers, and what's possible for, you know, to be in the ways that you're working with advertisers at Disney Ad Sales?
Yeah, and we've been building towards this really kind of with an eye on it for a long time. And so we have probably 1,000 various kind of predictive models around audience segmentation, and they include things like foot traffic and propensity to purchase and those kinds of things. So we're really operating in a space where a lot of the kind of targeting and the segments that we're delivering the outcome is in mind when we're doing that. And now, sort of in partnership with Asaf and the work that we're doing with Samba and Ashwin and team, it's really, what is the closed loop look like? What is the feedback loop, so that we're starting, we think, with really high quality, efficient targeting. But as the process kind of evolves and we're thinking more about, you know, what advertising, what creative on what platform, and kind of what timing, and how do we shape the frequency of that for the ultimate outcome? What does the closed loop look like? So that the feedback comes and we can start optimizing against that, so that we're constantly refining all of our models, so that we're on the front end and the back end kind of really aligned. And that's exactly what we went to market with Samba. And so that's kind of coordination between the Disney Ad Sales, which we're all together. So Hulu, Disney, ESPN, ABC, all of us together, along with Samba. This is what that looks like. Here's how our models overlay on linear television. Here's what that exposure looks like across the board. And here's how we think that attribution benefited from that. And then what's the loop look like coming back, so we continue to optimize and refine to improve the offering.
Got it. And we have just under a minute left. So I'd love to close with kind of the future of cross-platform attribution, which is very difficult to squeeze into 50 seconds. But Ashwin, just you being the most in the thick of it, what major milestones or progress do you expect to see over the next year or two when it comes to cross-platform campaign attribution?
I'm really excited about the work we're doing in frequency. I think we've all been in that situation, sitting in front of a streaming platform and said, gosh, I've seen that ad a lot in the last sitting. And maybe it's not deduplicated from linear to OTT, which might exacerbate what I think all marketers are understanding right now is a big source of waste in our industry. And to manage frequency, and particularly the ways that this team today is presented, I think is a huge leapfold improvement over the past. So excited about that.
Great. I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you, everyone.